So this is going to be a presentation on the Twitter streaming API. And what I'm going to do is talk about how to use the Twitter streaming API to basically listen for any kind of tweets that contain certain keywords or were tweeted by certain users or mention certain users, and then store those in MongoDB. So this is going to be a pretty basic overview of the Twitter streaming API. And then I wrote a simple little Ruby script that you can actually deploy to something like Heroku to basically listen for these tweets and drop them into a MongoDB database. So I'm going to go over that as well. The first thing I want to show off is just a little demo. What I'm going to show here is basically anybody that's mentioning Ashton Kutcher in their tweets. His Twitter username is A+K, at A+K. I don't actually have to be the person that follows Ashton Kutcher for this to work. I am going to actually require one of my own Twitter accounts because Twitter requires a username and password for you to use the Twitter streaming API. But that doesn't mean I have to follow him. I'm not going to show just people who basically, I'm going to show anybody in the entire Twitter world who's tweeting about Ashton Kutcher. We've got a few more people kind of coming in, so I'm going to let them have a seat. So what I'm showing off here is, here's the little Ruby script that I wrote. And what it's doing is it's actually listening to all of Twitter, see if anyone's tweeting about Ashton Kutcher. Now, when I wrote this was actually working a little bit more interesting, probably because people were kind of sitting at their computers. Right now it might be kind of a sunny day or something like that on a Saturday, so not as many people are tweeting about him as there could be. What you can see here is pretty much up there somebody wrote at A+K. I don't know who that person is. I'm not logging that information right now. But I'm taking all those tweets there and sticking them into my database. And so this is kind of just random. Yeah, there's somebody from LSRC. I kind of wondered how long it would take for someone to do something like that. Just keep it clean, I guess. It's kind of a family, Lone Star Ruby conference. So you can pretty much put anything you want up here. And all these tweets are going to be stored into a database, which is pretty cool. Depending on what I'm trying to listen to, what I'm trying to do with all these tweets, I can go back and analyze those later. So right now this is a little bit sleepy. I don't know exactly what's going on with Ashton Kutcher these days. Maybe he's not quite as interesting. Sure. So let me just talk a little bit about the actual technology there. This is using the Twitter streaming API, which Twitter released, basically as a way of reducing load on their own servers, and also giving everyone as developers kind of an interesting way to view Twitter stuff. Also going to be talking a little bit about MongoDB, but not as much. MongoDB is a NoSQL database, so it's similar to MySQL in the sense of you're going to keep it in the same place in your application architecture, but it's not exactly the same. You don't use SQL to do your querying. You don't necessarily set up exactly the same way. And it has a lot of features that MySQL doesn't have. For instance, you can do map and reduce directly with MongoDB. It's got pretty good support for auto sharding, and that's what a lot of people are using it for. And then last, what I built is not a web application. So this isn't a Rails application. This isn't a Sinatra app. It's actually just a command line app. And the cool thing about that is you can actually go ahead and then deploy that wherever you want. So I'm going to talk a little bit about getting information back from Twitter. Twitter itself, the new Twitter, if you go to twitter.com, is actually just a big pile of JavaScript that actually speaks to itself using the Twitter API. So they've exposed everything you need to write a Twitter client as part of their API. They have several different APIs, though. The one I'm talking about is the Twitter streaming API. And that is really useful for connecting to Twitter once, holding that connection, and then saying, hey, any tweets that contain these keywords or follow these users or come from, say, this location, send them on over. The next kind of streaming API is the user stream. And what that is basically all of my tweets that would show up in my Twitter feed on twitter.com are basically in my user stream. And so if I make a different connection to Twitter and use OAuth for authentication, I can get my user stream and basically use that to build some sort of general purpose Twitter client. Now, Twitter is currently discouraging people from doing just that. They've changed how they're interacting with their own developers who use the API. So you don't want to necessarily try and build your own general purpose Twitter client for like Mac. They're actually kind of actively discouraging that sort of thing. But if you have another kind of use case, this might be really useful. For people who are building some kind of web-based Twitter client for the whole world, you'd use something called site streams. And what site streams is, it's basically a collection of all these user streams. So this is really for pretty big projects. For instance, you're building some kind of crazy web interface that basically pulls in, everyone's Twitter streams and does something with them. You'd have to talk to Twitter about getting this. They really want you to make sure your code works with user streams and doesn't consume too many of their resources first. Then you can use site streams. A lot of people are familiar with the Twitter REST API. That's actually the most common way of interacting with Twitter. If you use the Twitter Gem with Ruby, that actually uses the REST API for most of its stuff. And that's actually a great way of pulling down, for instance, the latest 150 tweets about something. Or if you wanted to get the last tweets by a person, for instance, if I'm at Jeff Linwood, I could call the REST API and say, hey, send me the last 100 tweets by Jeff Linwood, and it would actually send that over in JSON format. And then last is Search API. This is a slightly different API just because Twitter bought another company that provided this service, and they haven't integrated the APIs yet. So going to the Twitter Streaming API, that's kind of the focus of this little script. And you can track three things. You can track keywords, you can track users, and you can track locations. With keywords, you basically get an OR. So you can have thousands of keywords, but it's an OR search, not an AND search. So if I'm looking for iPhone apps, I look for iPhone and I look for app, and I'll get things that mention an iPhone, I'll look for things that mention app. If I'm looking for users, same things. So I could follow myself at Jeff Linwood. I could follow somebody else's tweets. It wouldn't just give me the tweets that just mentioned both of us. And then last is locations. So this is kind of neat. You can actually set a bounding box and get all the tweets from, say, within Austin, Texas, or the state of New Mexico, or whatever, and then go ahead and do something with those. So all of this code uses someone else's gem. It's the TweetStream Gem. And that's actually pretty powerful stuff. I really enjoy kind of learning a little bit more about it. It uses Event Machine, if you guys are familiar with that, for async stuff with Ruby. Really, TweetStream does all the heavy lifting for this code. There's not a lot of crazy stuff going on here. It's really just kind of a basic application of TweetStream stuff with my code to just kind of integrate with Mongo. So this is definitely where you would go to learn more about this, would be to this GitHub page. So when you connect to the Twitter Streaming API, you're going to get JSON responses back. And let me show you one of those right now. So here's a sample tweet in JSON. That's pretty readable. They're really big. So when you guys think of tweets, they're 140 characters. You'd think that their JSON format would actually be pretty small. It's not. It's pretty big. It's got a lot of stuff in it. And so the first part that we're looking at with this tweet is we've got like I got all kinds of stuff about here's the text. Was it retweeted? It says false. Inside the text it says RT. Partly that's because Twitter has some weird stuff going on with tweets, like official retweets versus like other retweets. And so you can't really rely on just that retweeted false. coming down, they tell you all kinds of interesting information about the user. Again, depending on what you're going to be doing with this information, you can take the user stuff in here and build your application. I have this person's location. I believe INA might be in Indonesia, but I'm not sure about that. And then Twitter actually parses out the tweet for you. So even though this is only 140 characters, and I'll show it to you, what this person put. RT, iPhone, review, whole bunch of stuff. And then right there, that http://t.co is a short URL. Inside the JSON, Twitter's actually parsed that 140 character text out into the URLs and the entities that were mentioned inside, which is kind of an interesting thing for them to do. I guess it saves me a little bit of processing, so I don't have to parse these URLs out myself, but it's also a little bit strange. So looking here, we have a URL, and the short URL was http://t.co. What that means is that Twitter itself shortened it. And so they actually have an expanded URL here that actually maps to the real URL of what that person was sending out. Yeah, there's the short URL. Does that make sense to everybody, kind of like that short URL stuff? And I think part of the advantage here is that Twitter says, hey, we can do the work once and then send it out to all the people that are listening, and you guys can kind of save yourself some trouble, which is kind of nice. But it also leads to this really verbose JSON format. So again, if I'm building a Twitter client, I can also hot link those mentions of like another Twitter user. For instance, there's a screen named the iPhone review, which is presumably someone's Twitter username. I actually have their user ID in there, so I could take this information, parse it out, and maybe add them to my database to be followed in the future, or whatever I decide to do with this particular application. But they've done all that work of basically parsing out that user, getting a user ID for me, and just passing it to me. And then last, there's a hashtag in there. You could certainly build an application that just followed hashtags if you wanted. Totally acceptable. In this case, they're using the hashtag GeoGame. They've parsed that out for me too. Again, it's just like something nice that Twitter did, that if I was writing some sort of tool that relied on hash Ruby or something like that, I could actually kind of take a look at all my tweets and say, okay, well, these are the hashtags with Ruby in them. So that's kind of just a sample tweet with JSON. It's pretty big though. And as you can see, the structure is kind of interesting. There's a lot of stuff going on in here. And so I could certainly write something that would then parse this out into MySQL or use Active Record or something like that. But one advantage of MongoDB is that basically the format that it speaks, BSON, is very similar to JSON. So I can actually take this and basically put it into MongoDB, which I find pretty useful. So that's the JSON response that you'll get back from the Twitter streaming API. And that's basically on every tweet, you'll get a piece of JSON that looks just like that. To connect to the Twitter streaming API, you're going to have to use HTTP basic authentication. So if you've worked with some of the other Twitter APIs, they use OAuth. With this, it uses HTTP basic authentication. And I believe that the reasoning for that is probably that people that run Twitter streaming API are not, you don't generally run that from like an end user client usually. You'll run it on some kind of server. For instance, if you're building some kind of like social media intelligence tool or social media analysis type tool, you would actually use something like this connection to the Twitter streaming API. So basic auth makes a lot of sense. One important note to that is that Twitter limits you to basically one stream per account. So if you're like me and you have this running, say, up on Heroku, and then you also have something you're actually developing on actively, you'll need 2 Twitter accounts with 2 usernames and passwords. That's not usually too big a deal to just make one. But you may run into weird problems if, for instance, you're using your production Twitter name with this. Now, you're not going to worry about, like, your app is not going to tweet stuff back out on that account. Twitter, I think, just uses these username and passwords basically just control access. So you're not actually logging in to tweet something back out under that account or anything like that. When you connect to the Twitter streaming API, Twitter is trying to minimize their costs of running a business. And so for them, opening HTTP connections turns out to be really expensive. So what they want you to do is just leave this connection open. That's actually not too big a deal. I've had this stuff running up for 10, 11 days at a time with holding an open connection to Twitter. You don't want to constantly reconnect to Twitter. So basically, they kind of reserve the right to ban you if you're writing something really wacky that's constantly calling Twitter, asking for the streaming API, and then it shuts itself down. I haven't heard of anyone actually getting shut down for that, but they certainly reserve the right if you're trying to abuse it. What's more likely is they recognize you're probably just in development and something's messed up. So here's some limitations. Just out of the box, you don't have to ask Twitter for access to this API. You can just use it. Some of the limitations with that access are that you have 400 keywords that you can follow. You have 5,000 user IDs, and you have 25 location boxes. There is additional access. So with Twitter, if you're actually doing something pretty powerful and running into these limitations, you can actually ask them for increased access, and they'll grant it to you. It's kind of in their interest to give you as much access to their tweets up to a certain point. So here's a really illegible slide, but that's where I was going to go to the text editor. But that's exactly what I just already showed you. So going to kind of the second half of this presentation, I just want to talk about MongoDB a little. You could just certainly do anything you want with those tweets. You don't have to store them in MongoDB. But I think it's a pretty good solution for this particular application. You'll actually see a lot of demos of Node.js, which is pretty similar to the Ruby event machine in terms of where you'd use it. And they'll use MongoDB to store tweets in. It's kind of a classic example. Like I said before, MongoDB is NoSQL. So you don't use SQL. You don't use your existing stuff to talk to it. It has its own drivers for Ruby. It is a great fit for this kind of thing because it itself is basically JSON-oriented. That if you're getting these tweets from Twitter and you don't really want to parse them, you just want to drop them in the database and analyze them later, maybe because you don't even know what you're going to do with them, then MongoDB makes kind of a great solution. It has its own query language. So that's kind of one downside, is that you're going to have to learn how to redo a bunch of things you already know how to do in MySQL or SQL if you're going to use MongoDB. It's not too far off. You can do most of the stuff. You just can't do everything the same way. And then last, if you're big into the MapReduce stuff for doing aggregation, MongoDB's got support for that. With Ruby, it's a little funky because you're basically writing these JavaScript MapReduce functions in your Ruby code and then passing them to Mongo. It works pretty well. It's just a little strange to have Ruby code and then little chunks of JavaScript and then more Ruby code. For what we're doing, though, we're just taking these tweets and dropping them into the database. So I'm not going to cover any of this stuff about querying or MapReduce in this little project. So when you go to store data in MongoDB, the native format that you use to talk back and forth is BSON, which is similar to JSON. To use MongoDB, you connect to a database. So that's a little bit similar to MySQL. What is not the same is that you can connect to a collection, and if it doesn't exist, it will create it when you start adding stuff to the collection. So that's different from MySQL, where you have to actually set up tables and a table structure. So this is kind of an interesting little concept of you can put anything you want in these collections. You can have documents that have different schemas. So I could take tweets with that JSON format, drop them into one collection in MongoDB, and then just go ahead and drop something else with a different schema into it. And then last, just insert JSON. So to bring this back to Ruby, for what I'm going to use the MongoDB Gem, which comes from 10gen, which is kind of the creators of MongoDB. And then they suggest that you use their native gem bson ext. And that's basically just some sped up instructions for working with their bson format. So they just kind of suggest you install that for speed. And then to learn more about MongoDB and Ruby, you can go to the mongodb.org Ruby Language Center. And their documentation is kind of a little bit all over the place, but this is kind of the main place you go. Has anyone here worked with MongoDB and Ruby before? Cool, a bunch of people. Are you guys using MongoDB with like the active record stuff, or are you using it with the Mongo Gem? Mongo Mapper. Yeah. Mongoid, yeah. Cool. So some considerations for using MongoDB. You guys saw those tweets. They're pretty verbose. And then also the date formats in tweets doesn't exactly match the date format that you're going to use with MongoDB. So one suggestion there would be, because these are tweets and they're coming right across the stream, just add your own timestamp, and that would pretty much solve that problem. Or you can convert them later. You may want to pre-process your tweets if you don't actually want to fill up your database with a whole bunch of junk, because you're listening to all kinds of crazy stuff. You may want to pre-process them just before you dump them in your database. For instance, I might want to only dump in the user ID and the actual text of the tweet. And then last, just because you're using MongoDB doesn't mean that you can't use MySQL in the same app. You can certainly do that. You can certainly build your Rails app using MySQL and then just use MongoDB to store the tweets. So here's the code. And you'll see it's actually pretty simple. Can you guys read that? No? OK. Is that better in the back? OK, good. So this is just a really simple Ruby script that I put together. Basically, we're loading up a little config file, and all that has is my Twitter username and password. Just username and password. Pretty simple. Let's see how far this goes over. One interesting thing I did is that I set up this script to deploy on Heroku or locally. And on Heroku, I'm using the MongoLab add-on, which basically gives me free MongoDB hosting in the cloud up to like 250 megs. And Heroku actually sets up an environment variable with basically the URI to my MongoDB. And so basically, I have a little piece of code in here that basically pulls that environment out if it's running on Heroku, parses it, and then connects to the Mongo database. And that's actually this first chunk here. This line here, you can't really see it as well because there's not as much contrast, but the Mongo connection new DB, that's actually for connecting to Mongo running on the local host. So currently, I've actually got Mongo running on my local host on this laptop, and that's kind of my local environment. So all the tweets are going to be stored into a collection, and I can name that anything I want. In this case, it's app-tweets. That part doesn't really matter too much. And then I've also got the set of keywords that I'm tracking. In this case, it's just A plus K, nothing real fancy. I can actually have up to 400 of those keywords as an array. One possible extension to this would be to pull the keywords you're tracking out of something else, so they're not hard-coded in the Ruby script. This is just kind of the simplest way of getting it going. I use the Twitter gem to basically get the people I'm following off of my Twitter account. All that information is actually public unless you make your Twitter account private. So I can use the Twitter REST API to get the list of users that I'm following and actually pull that down as an array of user IDs. And then down here, that TweetStream Gem that I mentioned earlier, I have I'm making a client here. And what I'm doing is just pulling out my username and password from that config file. See if I can get this to scroll over up here. There we are. Just pulling out my username and password. And that's really all the information I need to make a connection to Twitter. The actual TweetStream Gem knows which URL to connect to at Twitter. All that's kind of baked into it, so you don't have to set up any kind of weird configuration there. Up here, Twitter just asks that you respect people's delete their tweet requests. So if you tweet something out, you can actually delete it. Twitter will basically send out something saying, hey, this person deleted this particular, this particular tweet, and TweetStream has support for that. So if you just provide your own little block that basically removes, a tweet from your storage, then basically, you're kind of being nice. And so what I'm doing here is just on that MongoDB collection tweets, I'm just calling a method remove. And then what I'm doing is removing any tweet with that status ID, because basically Twitter says, hey, remove this status ID. So then the last part, and really, this is really simple. All it's really doing here is then I call the filter method on that TweetStream client that I set up, and I pass in the parameters of who I'm following and who I'm tracking. And just for the purposes of this, I comment out the following users. I just pass that in, and then basically every time that I get a new tweet coming in over my Twitter connection, I get a status, and I basically print out to the screen and then insert it into the MongoDB. So it's really just those 3 lines of code right there that do everything that you're kind of seeing in the background here with the Ashton Kutcher stuff. Really just 3 lines of code do all that, which is pretty cool to me. If you think about all the kind of the work that would go into creating that with kind of like a little bit more verbose language or something like that, this is actually pretty cool. So that's kind of the walk through the little script. I mean, there's not really much more to it than that. So I threw the thing up on GitHub with a couple files you might need if you're going to install it to Heroku. And basically, that's just up on my little GitHub thing. And I'll have the URL for that at the end if you can't read it here. It might be a little bit hard to read.
Is your username and password in the config file?
No, it's not. And actually, I had to be really careful about that because basically it is like hard-coded. They don't use like a secret or anything like that. And so I had to be like really careful not to accidentally add my username and password to GitHub, because it's funny when you search for that, tons of people do that. And it's so I'm really careful about not making sure that my stuff gets into GitHub, because it's you guys would get access to this Twitter account that I used 5 months ago and haven't really touched since except for this. And you could tweet all kinds of crazy stuff on it. But yeah, very good point, very good point. I mean, I'm pretty sure that happens pretty often. So yeah, yeah. So where do you go ahead and run this? I'm just running it from my command line with bundle exec. You can certainly set up your own server to run this. So if you have a VPS or just your own server, it's kind of up to you. I went ahead and set up mine using Heroku and MongoLab, which is sort of a hosted Mongo provider. And I've actually put directions on how to deploy it to Heroku using MongoLab up on my website, which I'll give a link to at the end too. But I just put those directions together today. And so if you're going to deploy it to Heroku, you have to use the Cedar stack. But that's pretty cool because you can use this procfile stuff to run a process that isn't a web, it's not a web worker, it's just a command line. And you can actually run that up in Heroku. Now, if you're familiar with Heroku, you can actually scale up the number of processes you run. But in this case, you can actually only ever have one of these running at a time. So for one username and password, you have one of these that makes a connection to Twitter. You don't have 6 of them. And then, of course, you could run other cloud services. So if you actually set up Heroku and configure it, there's 2 Mongo hosting tools that they use that they kind of provide as add-ons, MongoHQ and MongoLab. I chose to go with MongoLab mostly because the pricing was a little bit better. To me, so far, I'm not really sure what the difference is. But here's a screenshot of the MongoLab UI. And so they give you a little bit of a visual interface for inspecting the tweets or anything else that you store in your MongoDB. So what are you going to do with this? And so kind of your step 1 is collect tweets. And then step 2, nobody really knows. This is just the really basic part of it, right? Is that pulling down these tweets from Twitter, you can get them put in your database. But then what are you going to do with them after that? And that's kind of the big question is, what would be really cool to do with this? And so if you have any cool ideas, you could take a look at that TweetStream Gem and kind kind of get some cool ideas going. And then to learn more, I've got a link up to the very top, and that's actually to the Twitter API docs, which you'd want to read, just to get an idea of what they're letting you do with their information. To learn a little bit more about Mongo, pretty much you can just go to the mongodb.org. If you want to download that script, just stick it up on GitHub. And then down that URL there will take you to my latest blog entry, which is basically just the instructions for deploying it on Heroku with the Cedar stack. And then if you have more other stuff, you can follow me on Twitter. And that is it. So does anyone have any questions? Cool. I guess I explained it very well.
So, question marks. What cool things have people done?
That's actually,
Necessarily for fraud.
yeah, that's actually the oh, sure, yeah. So she asked what people have done with this. And so far, nobody I know of is using this actual code that I wrote. I'm not really sure about that, but I don't think they are. But a lot of people are using this type of technology for building like social media analytics platforms. So apparently there's a big market in connecting big brands that basically are worried about their image on Twitter. So basically, for instance, if you worked for a company like Southwest Airlines and people are complaining because your flights are not on time or your planes are dirty or whatever, then you could use a tool like this to kind of monitor your online reputation. And I think there's quite a few companies that do exactly just that. So they provide sort of a level of searching, customer service, and analytics that let companies kind of figure out what people are talking about. And so that would be like a really good application for something like this. Because if I ran a company like that, I might have to monitor hundreds or thousands of keywords for my clients. And if I needed that, then the Twitter streaming API would totally be the way to go. Because the other Twitter APIs are rate limited, so they restrict the number of requests you can make. Is that kind of what you were asking? Yeah, and so there's other cool stuff you could do with it too. People are using this kind of thing for like sentiment analysis or monitoring trends. So for instance, if you were wondering about what what's kind of hot right now, and you thought that people on Twitter would know that kind of thing, which that's kind of an unproven hypothesis, but you could use something like this for that. So, any other questions? Cool. Yeah, I mean, oh yeah, go ahead.
So does Twitter put any restrictions on storing of tweets and that sort of thing? Restrictions on rates, I think we talked about this last night.
Yeah,
Restrictions on what developers can do.
they do. Depending on what you're building, Twitter may not. Oh, sorry, yeah. He asked what kind of restrictions does Twitter put on you? And that's actually listed in the API. It's a really good question. So they do have some pretty strict terms of service. For instance, they've stopped some of the tweet backup services that people were offering, where they would actually go in and store your tweets as kind of a backup service, and then you could republish them. Twitter kind of blocks you republishing raw tweet information for the most part. But then they allow you to do other things, like for instance, I can have a block of tweets on my blog that are things that I've tweeted. So it's somewhere in their terms of services what exactly you're looking to do may or may not be allowed. I don't think they're super strict about cracking down on that kind of stuff. Like I don't think they're really coming down hard on people. I think they're just trying to establish what they're up to. Because I think they started with the API, let anyone do whatever they wanted with it, and now they're trying to make money with it. They're trying to figure out how to kind of crack down and establish some space for themselves in there. So, cool. All right. Well, thanks.